Welcome to the Microsoft Australian OEM Server Teams update for February 2016. In this update, we're going to be focusing on something that has got implications both on the server side as well as on the client side, which is the latest information on the Internet Explorer end of support for older versions. So we'll go through and we'll talk about a few of the things that you can do to help reduce some of the issues that you may face with customers who still do have dependencies on IE for earlier websites or web applications, and also the impact that this can have on some of the non-support or the older operating systems, both on the server front as well as on the desktop side. So let's jump in now into the main topic, and then we'll move on to some of the upcoming events and some of the resources you should be on top of. So first up, let's take a look at the end of support for older versions. And a good place to start here is to take a look at what is actually the minimum current supported version now. So there's some important things here to note, because some of the ways that this has been reported has been, any version of IE prior to 11 is now non-supported. But as you can see, as you take a look at the list of the different operating systems here, that's not necessarily true on older operating systems. So if we take a look here at Windows Vista SP2, now I don't expect too many of you to have lots of customers still on old versions of Windows that are like from the Vista era, but in this case, you can see that IE9 is the latest version, because that's the latest version that Microsoft has supported. So this will be supported until Vista reaches its end of support at the end of its regular support lifecycle. Now, as we take a look at Windows Server, you'll see some similar things here, where the 2008 editions of Windows Server, because they do have that same, they're working from the same code base as Vista, they do have that Internet Explorer 9 limitation as well. But then when we get to Windows Server 2012, this one's a little bit different. You'll see that it's got that requirement for Windows 10. There's no, Internet Explorer 10. There's no IE 11 option here. Now, to put this in perspective from a desktop side, the reason why you're not seeing the desktop piece, a desktop IE 10 requirement there, is that the equivalent desktop operating system is Windows 8, which has already, it's reached end of support. You need to update that to Windows 8.1, which pretty much, every Windows 8 user, tried to do as quickly as humanly possible, because there were a lot of big improvements jumping from Windows 8 to 8.1. Now, there's obviously a lot more information behind the scenes with this. So if you do have more information and you do need more information, and you need to talk to some customers about support life cycles, etc. for IE, especially if they've got some other devices or operating systems, so things that have got a dependency on embedded versions of Windows, for example, as you can expect, it's going to have some limitations in terms of even earlier versions of IE. So if you take a look at this URL that I've got here, just pause for a moment, write it down, or type it in now and jump out and take a look at that URL. It's got the details on all the different versions of IE, on the different supported versions of embedded versions of Windows as well. So keep that one in mind. Now, when we take a look at Windows 10 from a browser perspective, we've really got two different choices here inside the operating system. So from your typical desktop, whether it's the current branch or the current branch for business, what you can see here is that we've got a choice of either using Edge or Internet Explorer 11. And as we go through the rest of this presentation, what you'll see here is that effectively Edge is really, the browser that you should be looking at in terms of, forwards compatibility, modern web standards that are coming out, for example. Whereas Internet Explorer in a Windows 10 environment really should be targeting those scenarios where you may have legacy requirements. So, those legacy requirements may be, Internet Explorer add-ons or plugins or extensions, for example. Or it may even just be the degree of backwards compatibility that Internet Explorer provides. So these will be a big focus of some of the things that we cover through the rest of the presentation. Now, what we've also got here is the long-term servicing branch of Windows 10 on the desktop. Now, this is something that can only include Internet Explorer 11, because this is designed for environments where people don't want things that need to be updated on a regular basis. So they basically want to commit to something that will have a very, very long support life cycle. So the long-term servicing branch of Windows 10, there are some features that it's missing that are normally inside of Windows 10. So it doesn't include support for the Edge browser, because that's something that does get periodic updates in terms of new capabilities. But also things like Windows Store Access, modern apps, etc. These are things that you can't actually get through the long-term servicing branch. So it's really a limited scenario type. version of Windows 10 on the enterprise front. Now you'll see that Windows 10 Mobile only includes Edge, the Surface Hub. Current thinking is that Edge is definitely in there, not too sure about IE 11. Then with Xbox, you'll see at the moment it's got both the Internet of Things core. Even though it says it doesn't have Edge or Internet Explorer, it does still have a web rendering engine in there, so that if someone is interested in this and they're building their own apps, then they can just call on some of the other system features to get access to, websites and HTTP, HTTPS type content. And then HoloLens, obviously Edge is going to be supported there, and to be determined whether IE 11 will be included in the support side for that. So if we take a look at the Windows browser roadmap, effectively what we've got here is, realistically speaking, it's just IE 11 and Edge from here on out on modern operating systems. So with Windows 7, we've got Internet Explorer 11 as being Microsoft supported option. I've already mentioned with Windows 8, really it's a matter of getting customers across to Windows 8.1. And on Windows 8.1, obviously they can run Internet Explorer 11. And then on Windows 10, you can easily run and happily run Internet Explorer 11 and Edge side by side. So pretty easy process to go through and do that. Now, the thinking here is that for customers who are on Windows 7 and have got legacy web applications or websites that they are frequently accessing, that going through and doing a migration to Internet Explorer 11 will make it easy for them to go through and do that migration to Windows 10 in the future. So having IE 11 successfully rolled out, so doing the compat testing, etc., the user testing before you move over to Windows 10 is really going to simplify that migration process and the support requirements afterwards. So what are some of the benefits of Internet Explorer 11? Well, we're not going to go through all of these because obviously there's a fair few different ones that we've got in here, but probably the big one that we'll focus on with this one, because obviously there are new features, but what we really want to focus on in this session is, how do we deal with things like backwards compatibility? So what we've got here is the enterprise mode site list where we can go through, we can set IE enterprise modes, and we've also got the different document modes. So really trying to make sure that we've got fantastic support for older apps that may have been built with much older versions of Internet Explorer in mind. So if certain vendors were taking advantage of some of the capabilities of Internet Explorer that only Internet Explorer offered, knowing that there's a good chance you'll be able to get these things working without too much problem with IE 11. And we'll talk about the enterprise mode site list and the different tools for discovery as we go through the presentation. Now, other things in here, just a quick one here, is things like, big improvements in JavaScript performance here. So making sure that, even though, Edge really is the focus moving forward in the long term for Microsoft, knowing that IE 11 isn't sitting there resting on its hands, that the team is really trying to make sure that they can keep it moving forward as well. Now, as we take a look at Internet Explorer 11 compatibility, one of the big things that really started changing here from the early versions of IE through to the later standards was a lot of the IE development that went on during the early days was, very much focused on enabling new capabilities and, a big focus on what were the things that customers need, what were the features Microsoft wanted in there. And that meant, though, at times, there were situations where there were certain web standards that, Microsoft did support in, did support in preference to supporting others. And that caused issues in some places, whereas it helped in others. But now it's at the stage where, apps that were designed during those early days or targeting early versions of Internet Explorer, we've all encountered situations where we may have had to switch back to some type of compatibility view in order to actually render them properly. So the idea that now is that, making sure that developers who are building out websites really are just targeting these modern web standards rather than having to go through and target a specific browser for the functionality they want. Now, we've mentioned enterprise mode a couple of times, so let's talk about it now. But enterprise mode for IE 11, it's all around providing this backwards compatibility. So one of the things you'll see referenced repeatedly in today's presentation is reference for web apps. And a question that commonly comes up is, well, what's the difference between a website and a web app? It depends on who you talk to. Some people will try to give you a view that it's No one will really tell you that it's a black and white view. Some people will say that, if you're just there and you're just consuming what's being provided to you, think of it as a website. But if it's something that you're interacting with, something where you may be entering forms into data, where you may be doing queries, etc., then think of it more as a web app. But the problem now, though, is that a website, if you're following that logic, would really only apply to, maybe a really basic site built out of HTML pages with no other real smart logic sitting there behind it. And these days, everything is a lot more intelligent than that. So there is, generally, a multi-tier design, even in a lot of the, the most simple websites that you see out there. So generally these days I view them as being fairly interchangeable. You can nitpick in some cases, but web apps are really, in this case, I think if we talk about web apps, probably the best way to position it from a customer perspective is web apps are apps that they're using via the browser. Rather than thinking about it in terms of what sites are they browsing to get news information, that doesn't necessarily fall in as well. Now, IE mode, or sorry, enterprise mode for IE 11, it works with 7, 8.1, Windows 10. So, again, you'll see that Windows 8 isn't listed here because Windows 8 doesn't support IE 11. It only still goes up to Windows 10. And, as we've already mentioned, Windows 8 has already reached end of support. So, as we've already discussed as well, the idea here is to go through and ease that browser upgrade process by having to reduce web app testing and remediation. So going through and just being able to drop things into a compatibility mode rather on the client side and have that automated to a degree, rather than having to go through on older websites, for example, and start trying to figure out what's going on in the code there. Now, for customers who were going through some of these, the testing and migration pieces early on, Microsoft did some surveys of some of the IT pros out there, and they found that 47% of those that they surveyed said the upgrade was actually easier than they expected, and 90% of them used the backwards compatibility features to ease the migration. So that's really telling you a good story, that using that backwards compatibility really makes life easier. Now, obviously, there are some things that we're not getting out of that, such as, the 53% who didn't find it easier. Was it because it was as easy as they expected, or was it harder than they expected? And out of those, how many of them were using the backwards compatibility features? So obviously, okay, there's some good stuff here though from the ones who did find it was a good experience. That using some of these compatibility tools really did make this whole process easier. Now, as we move to Microsoft Edge, one of the important things with Edge, and for those of you using Windows 10, especially those of you on the Windows Insider builds, so if you're not familiar with Windows Insider, this is where you get frequently updated versions of Windows. So you've got multiple rings of Windows 10 that are in motion at the same time, but you're effectively getting preview builds of what may eventually get rolled out to end users. And one of the things in here, so obviously Windows or Microsoft Edge being included here means that it gets new capabilities rolled in. So some of the things from my perspective that have made Edge much more usable over the previous, as we've gone through the different builds, even some of the simple things that were missing at the beginning, the ability to right mouse on a link and save a file, for example. So even though you could click on it and a download would be initiated, you didn't really get much control over where it went once from that process. So there are some usability improvements, and they're constantly adding new capabilities to Edge through the Insider preview. So it's one of those things where it's getting additional capabilities, but at this point in time, Edge definitely isn't designed to be all things to all people. And we'll talk about some of these things as we go through the next few slides. But one of the important things that Microsoft's added here is the ability for you to be able to easily switch over to Internet Explorer, so that if Edge hits something that it knows it shouldn't be dealing with, it will switch over to Internet Explorer to support those existing web apps that you may be using. Now, for those of you who are using tablets that may have handwriting capabilities, for example, so things like, I guess the obvious one there is Surface users, things like built-in note-taking and sharing directly in the browser. So, just little ways to leverage some of the capabilities that Windows 10 provides. And it's also got Cortana support directly built in. Now, when we take a look at, I guess, the longer-term future, this is really summarizing what I was saying earlier, where IE 11 is basically, you know, the de facto standard that a lot of corporate web apps were built to over the years. So it's got a job there to sort of make sure that those things keep running, and that, you know, customers have got ample time to migrate backend situations into support new environments. So, you know, just because the browser needs to be supported doesn't mean the customer's necessarily got the money to go through and re-architect the website to support things. So this really starts making that a lot easier. But moving forward, the idea is that, you know, Edge is, you know, the main, you know, Microsoft's main strategy moving forward. But again, as I've mentioned, remember that IE 11, you know, it is extended all the way through to, sorry, it is supported all the way through to, I think, 2020. Now the customer guidance here, obviously, okay, this information is information Microsoft has been handing out for a while now, but getting customers to go through and start doing the evaluation and testing and trying to migrate away from those older versions where possible prior to January 12. So obviously we're past this date now. So this means that, you know, making sure that, you know, if you've got customers still using older versions, you know, letting them know that, hey, okay, we need to do some work here. Here are some of the tools that we'll use to do this, to really make their life simple as they either, you know, are migrating on Windows 7, or maybe even going from you know, Windows 7 up to Windows 10 and making the browser migration an early part of that process. So the web app compatibility, if we just take a look at the, I guess, the quick summary here, and these are the things that we saw earlier. So, you know, if we take a look here, you know, compatibility with Internet Explorer 11 is really one of those big messages that's been that has been pushed. But then moving forward, you know, IE 11 will really be the legacy web approach inside of Windows 10. So there's not really, you know, a concern within the Edge team to go through and, you know, backport a lot of new standard support into IE. It's not really what they want to do. So instead, Edge is going to be where that goes to. Now, I've already mentioned that things like browser add-ons are one of the things that Edge doesn't support. So if you've got ActiveX control, so one of the ones you'll see in here is, you know, Microsoft Silverlight is included. So if you're using, you know, Microsoft still uses Silverlight for sites such as the Intune management portal, for example. You know, these are things that don't work within Edge. So Microsoft does have a new extension model becoming available for Edge moving forward, but it's not currently in any of the preview builds, so they don't really have too much to share about that just yet. So this is important though if you do have line of business applications that rely on these. So, you know, things like, you know, Intune management, other tools that require Silverlight or other plugins for management purposes, then obviously these are things that you do need to understand. So you can use the Enterprise Site Discovery Toolkit or the Microsoft the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, which we've covered in multiple previous video recordings, to determine what it is that's actually out there inside of the customer's environments. A lot of the time you'll find that, you know, when you do discovery of what's in there, you'll find that a lot of the things that are in there probably aren't really things that are needed moving forward. In a lot of cases it may be just you know, old drive-by installs that people didn't really want or need, such as 20 different toolbar extensions. And I think we've all got a friend or family member who, despite our best attempts to prevent them from doing those things, still figures out a way to do it. Now, previously, to get around some of the compatibility issues that may be introduced when moving to a new browser, you'd be using the compatibility view inside of Internet Explorer. So Microsoft has now removed the compatibility mode button in IE 11, but you've still got the ability to display intranet sites in compatibility view by default, and you can see here we've got a checkbox for that. But the recommendation instead is to really start using enterprise mode instead. So use enterprise mode to start specifying these things rather than making it something where the end user has to think about, should I or shouldn't I use this view. Now, on the enterprise site discovery side, what you're looking at doing here is, you know, trying to get a better idea of, you know, how IE is being used and what sites are being accessed. So you can go through, you can install it via PowerShell, you can manage it via PowerShell and group policy, but it works with IE 8, 9, 10, and 11 on Windows 7 or Windows 8.1, obviously IE 11 on Win 10 as well. But In this case, as we go through the different steps, okay, the user browses the web, and what happens is, by default, the data collection is turned off. But what we want to do with this is we actually want to enable data collection. So the data collection is enabled for all of the sites that are visited by the user unless it's configured otherwise. But it means that, each of those browsing events is associated to the browse URL. It really doesn't have much of an impact or any real impact on the IE performance, and then the administrators can go through and gather that collected information and then start identifying what they need to do, what to do with that. So we go through, we can do the site scoping and then basically pulling information out via WMI, and then we get a data-driven picture of the web environment. So instead of going, well, we think these are the sites that are most important, we can actually start getting real hard statistics around here is what the users are actually doing. Now, there's a lot that we can start identifying via enterprise site discovery. And as we take a look here, okay, the different versions of IE do have slightly different capabilities. As you see, as we go to IE 8 and IE 9, they do drop off the reporting on document mode reason and the browser state reason. But otherwise, if you take a look, you can see that there's a fair bit of information that starts getting collected here. So instead of asking someone and getting them to give the best guesstimate of what are the most critical sites that they need to address immediately, for example, this will give you, that real information that you can then start working from. So there's a lot of good information on enterprise site discovery. We've already referenced some of this material up on the OEM team blog site, and I'll give you the reference to that if you don't already visit that at the end of the presentation. Now, moving on to more enterprise mode, we've got the ability to go through. It can emulate Internet Explorer 7, Internet Explorer 8, and multiple, as I've mentioned earlier, multiple Internet Explorer document modes. But it's really designed to avoid, the most common compatibility problems. So what are the things that tend to catch the browser up most often? And they're the things that it knows how to deal with very, very easily. So as I mentioned earlier, with IE 11, it's supported until January 14, 2020. So if someone's saying, well, I don't know if I should really put much effort into identifying these old sites and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, what's causing issues, because they're not sure of the support time frame, well, we've got a good, just under 4 years where this is still a supported, not supported OS, but a supported browser. So definitely worth the investment there. So then when we take a look at enterprise mode and we take a look at, well, how does it work? Well, okay, we go through, we choose some pilot users, and as they go through and start browsing the web, or web application, the different websites, they can configure the web application and the websites to render in enterprise mode. That data can be collected, it can be sent back to a local site list, and then you can use that local site list to start distributing that. Or you can import the site list, you can modify it, and then you can then distribute that enterprise mode site list out to other users. So that way you can go through and have a handful of users to start with. Perhaps you don't necessarily want to do it with everyone, but a handful of users going through and running this, so that you can actually discover what's going on. And the idea there is that you can roll out IE with with something, with a high degree of confidence, knowing that, it's actually helping as you go through this process where it can collect information that's needed to make the migration simpler. Now, for the test and remediation approach, we've really got 4 main steps here. So the first one is assessing that. So using the Enterprise Site Discovery Toolkit. Now, I've got the download links for this included in the blog posts that I've already mentioned, but the URL for those I'll provide at the end of this. You can select those target groups of users, collect the information monthly, and as we've highlighted, determining the critical line of business apps. You don't want to have to sort of figure out every app. It's what are the things that people are actually using that are work related. Then with the testing, we go through, we can use IE 11 on some of the Windows 7 and 8.1 machines. We can test out those critical line of business web applications. We can select the pilot groups, or it may just be a handful of individuals, it may be larger groups, and then we can test that using enterprise mode, and then we can confirm that the add-ons that we require are also compatible with Internet Explorer. Now for the remediation, we can go through, we can go through, and we can use the F12 developer tool to go through and do additional assessment. So if we do need to do any remediation, we can go through and try to figure what's going on. And we can then go through and create and configure the enterprise mode site list. And then we can modify the websites as needed. So in a perfect world, you really don't want to have to modify websites, especially if you're not an HTML or a website designer, website coder, for example. But this is something that, if someone's running something really old, there may be scenarios where you do have to go through and do some minor tweaks. And then finally, for the migration, deploying IE11 out to everyone on Windows 7 and Windows 8.1 with confidence. Or alternatively, if you've done the IE11 with rollout to a small group of users on Windows 7 or Windows 8.1, and everything's working exactly as you'd expect it, knowing that you can also deploy Windows 10 and know that IE11 isn't going to be a problem there. And then finally, the big piece towards the end is, developing a strategy to move away from web applications, to move the web applications away from that enterprise mode reliance, because as long as you've got that enterprise mode reliance, you're going to have a dependency on Internet Explorer. And if you want to look at Edge, if you want to start using different mobile platforms, so you might need to use Edge on Windows Phone, you may need to use Safari on your iPad or iOS device. Okay, you don't really have an option to use these backwards compatibility modes that enterprise mode provides for you. So then finally, if we take a look at pulling a lot of this together, how we can start working with that, well, I guess here we can use a combination of the Enterprise Site Discovery Toolkit and the Enterprise Mode to help speed up the adoption of Internet Explorer 11 and Windows 10. And we can use the Enterprise Site Discovery Toolkit when IE11 isn't installed on the user's device. So we can get the users to browse the webs, the application or application-based websites that they're using. You're capturing those usage patterns, as we've already discussed. The data can be collected, it can be sent back to a central source, and then we can do that bulk export that I've mentioned. So as the administrator, we can then take that information and we can modify as needed. So we can create this enterprise mode site list in Site List Manager to then apply that out to users via group policy. Then we can roll out IE11. So there's obviously a lot more to this, but again, I've already put some links up in the Oz OEM team blog site, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But before we do, let's just talk about some upcoming events which are targeting SMB partners in Australia. So first up, these are part of the Modern Business series. So these are ones that primarily target SMB customers who look after customers in the up to 250 seat space. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to be 250. It could be well under, it might be over it. But the idea there is to really expose you to a few different technologies that you may not normally be working with today that you need to get up to speed with quickly. So the first one that's happening is Safeguard Your Business. That's happening in Perth on the 16th of February. And that covers Windows 10 information around security, Enterprise Mobility Suite, Office 365 as well. And then on the 2nd and 3rd of March in Melbourne and Sydney, there's the Connect with Customers event, which includes SQL Server 2014 and Power BI related material, amongst other database and data related topics. And you'll see here that I've got an event ID after the date and city. So just go to msevents.microsoft.com. If you enter that event ID, then that will take you to the registration page for these events. Now to wrap up, we do have a number of resources to take a look at. But first up, we've got microsoftsmarthq.com.au. And this is really designed for Microsoft resellers so that, if you're working with servers, laptops, tablets, etc., that you can get a lot of information, across the board for OEM partners, system builders, and OEM reseller partners, rather than having to dig through a mountain of different sites from Microsoft to get that. Now, from a technical perspective, we've got the OEM and SMB focused information primarily on desktop Windows and Windows Server up at blogs.technet.com/Oz OEM team. Now that's something that we try to get out quite a few posts. So sometimes they'll be news or informational. Sometimes they're much more focused on doing a bit of a deep dive into the technology, and keep up to date on that one as well, because you'll find that there's a lot of good information. We if there's any important breaking news, we try to get it up there as quickly as we can. And then finally, we've also got a pre-sales support email address, so oemserverau@microsoft.com. And this is for non-product support related questions. So it's not around, if you're having issues doing something, what are the steps involved? It's not there to do that. Instead, it's focused on, if you need licensing information, just general product capabilities information, then email us on that, and we try to get a response through to you as quickly as possible. So with that, what I'd like to do is thank you for joining today's call. Hopefully you've got some useful information out of this. But if you want to get more of the URLs related to the content that we've covered during today's presentation, if you go to that blogs.technet.com/Oz OEM team, you'll find that there's a lot more information in there for you.